Is there any connection between these three elements? April 13th, 2029. Mark this date. Put it in your records. Keep it in mind. Yes, because on that date, a celestial body the size of a skyscraper, traveling at 45,000 km/h, will pass closer to Earth than the satellites that transmit your mobile phone signal. Its name? Apophis. You will be amazed to discover 7 connections between this celestial body, prophetic scriptures, and the moment of Christ's resurrection to rescue his community. And that is precisely what differentiates this content from all other prophetic videos you have ever watched. We will reveal what the US Space Agency is not communicating. What was the prophecy that the Hebrew people received 2 millennia ago? And what does the moment this celestial body approaches reveal about a rescue operation that is closer than anyone imagines? Therefore, the question is not whether Apophis is arriving. That is a certainty of science. The real question is, has God marked a countdown in the constellations themselves? Okay, let's start with what's verifiable. The objective and indisputable facts that even skeptics can accept. Apophis is tangible. It's not a theoretical assumption. It's not perhaps a possibility out there at some point. It's a confirmed, tracked, and catalogued object near our planet that cosmologists have been monitoring for 2 decades. Here's what we know about it: its measurements and displacement. Apophis is approximately 200 feet in size. This is roughly equivalent to 3.5 football fields placed end to end. Or, if you prefer a more perceptible reference, its size is roughly equivalent to the span of the Empire State Building from the ground to the 86th floor observatory, with a dimension of 365 meters. If Apophis were to collide with our planet, it would release power equivalent to about 200 megatons of explosive. That would be approximately 80,000 times more powerful than the atomic device detonated in Hiroshima. One collision, 80,000 times Hiroshima. The resulting explosion would only be capable of devastating everything within a perimeter of hundreds of kilometers from the point of impact. If it were to reach the ocean surface, the resulting overwhelming flow would be ruinous for coastal areas of various continental landmasses, and the dust dispersed in the stratosphere would modify global meteorological patterns for periods of time. This is not speculative narrative. It is what science and experimentation indicate would occur, and it is approaching us at a speed of approximately 28,000 miles every 60 minutes. At this point, the subject becomes truly captivating. On April 13th, 2029, specifically Friday the 13th, which I am convinced is merely a fortuitous coincidence, Apophis will make a crossing approximately 19,000 miles from the Earth's surface. Let me put that measurement into perspective. The human orbital laboratory is at an altitude of 100 kilometers. The Earth's natural satellite is positioned about 239,000 miles away. And most space communication instruments, those that manage your satellite location, video transmissions, and internet connections, orbit about 35,400 kilometers above. Apophis will approach Earth much closer than many of these devices. It will get so close that it will actually enter the space where such instruments circulate, and when that happens, it will be perceptible to the human eye in certain locations around the world. Humans will look up and witness a beam of light moving through celestial space, and we'll be talking about more than 1 billion tons of mineral and metallic material detonating beyond our globe. However, there is an additional aspect concerning this celestial body that should cause all researchers of sacred omens to pay the utmost attention. Sincerely, the designation. Why did scientists name this celestial body after an Egyptian deity linked to chaos? Apophis, in Egyptian mythological tradition, represented the serpent of the nocturnal depths, the embodiment of malevolence, the antagonist of Ra, the god of light. The ancient Egyptians believed that Apau sought to devour the luminous star every night, plunging reality back into fundamental chaos. And at each dawn, when the sun emerged, it demonstrated that Ra had subjugated Apau again. However, the Egyptian narrative also predicted that eventually Apus would prevail. One day, the beast would manage to consume the luminous star, and shadows would perpetually predominate. So my question is this: among countless viable names, among all the figures from cultural traditions and historical records they could have adopted, what reason led astronomers to name this particular celestial body after the ancient god of turmoil and ruin? Was it merely accidental, a casual decision, or did it carry some prophetic quality that they didn't even recognize? Because when you examine the Holy Scriptures, specifically the book of Revelation, you come across a prediction about an object falling from the sky, something that causes disturbance, something that brings about fatality, and it also has a title: Discovery 2, the Prophecy of Absinthe. Open your Bible to Revelation 8. Let's read verses 10 and 11, and I want you to focus your attention extraordinarily. Focus on the details, because what John presents here is impressive. Specifically, Revelation 8, 10, 11. And the second heavenly messenger sounded his trumpet, and a bright star like a flame fell from the Garden of Eden, and landed on a third of the rivers and on the freshwater reservoirs. And the name of the star is Wormwood. And a third of the water reservoirs turned into wormwood, and countless people perished from consuming those reservoirs because they had become poisonous. Let's examine this fragment by fragment, since every detail is important. A gigantic star falling. The Greek term is astro, which can denote a celestial body, but also refers to any celestial object. In antiquity, humans did not differentiate between stars, planets, balls, and meteoroids in the way we do today. They were all designated as stars. However, John identifies something specific. It's not a distant celestial body. It's a factor that has descended. It's collapsing. It's advancing towards Earth, burning like an incandescent lamp. The word present, lamp, is transformed into lamps, which designates a lit torch. Currently, consider what happens when a mineral body from space crosses the Earth's atmospheric layer. The collision with the particles causes the material to overheat to astronomical temperatures. It transforms into a moving sphere of incandescence, leaving a luminous trail. It looks precisely like a burning torch. John, composing 2,000 years ago, without any understanding of atmospheric dynamics or stellar particles, precisely outlines what a mineral body impacting would look like. It precipitated into the waters of the third proportion of rivers and into reserves of desalinated water, not in marine territories, but in river courses and desalinated water deposits. 1/3 of the planet's non-oceanic waters are undergoing transformation, and the star's titer is called absinthe. It is at this point that the subject takes on significant prophetic proportions. Wormwood is a vegetable mentioned on several occasions in ancient heritage. It is extraordinarily pungent, practically deleterious if consumed in large quantities. The Hebrew word is lana, and it is used as an analogy for bitterness, calamity, and divine judgment. In Jeremiah 9:15, the divinity declares, "Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of the nation of Israel, I will feed them, this whole population, with wormwood, and I will give them a drink from gall to drink." Wormwood personifies punishment, bitterness, the consequences of transgression. And John explains that the star that falls from the sky behaves like wormwood, and countless individuals died from ingesting those waters as they acquired a poisonous taste. It is not a depicted death. It consists of tangible bodily fatality caused by a contaminated reservoir. Now, observe what happens. Experts report that this would occur when a large mineral body collides with the Earth, especially near water reservoirs. The impact vaporizes astronomical quantities of rock mineral materials, propelling fragments into the gaseous layer. These fragments carry metal in toxic proportions and corrosive elements, as well as harmful compounds. When they rush back down into the world, they corrupt the water sources. The rivers acquire poisonous properties, the water sources become unfit for consumption, and the human beings who need those water sources perish. A third of the reserves will acquire a poisonous character. John observed this spectacle 20 centuries ago, and what he describes harmonizes perfectly with what modern technology tells us would happen in a meteorite collision. Therefore, the question arises, is the prophecy of Wormwood a literal or figurative expression? For centuries, scholars of faith have examined this statement. Some argue that it is entirely imagistic. They propose that Wormwood embodies spiritual abandonment, false doctrine, or the bitterness of guilt impacting the population. Others argue that it is factual. A concrete cosmic object will collide with our planet during the period of martyrdom, resulting in genuine loss of physical lives. However, here is what I would like you to consider. What if both cases were true? What if the Creator used real phenomena to express transcendental certainties? What if the falling mineral body is a concrete object and also a manifestation of divine retribution? What if the poisoned reserves simultaneously represent physical and spiritual fatality? Since this is how the Spirit proceeds throughout the sacred writings. The flood was a tangible event and a representation of condemnation. The Exodus was a true emancipation and an image of redemption. The crucifixion was a legitimate mortality and the means of rescue. The Eternal One doesn't need to choose between expression and symbolism. He uses both. And the moment you assess the proximity of Apophis, the connections become impossible to dismiss. However, before we get to that point, I need to show what the government corporation doesn't want to talk about. Because, as they tell the population not to worry, in the confines of secrecy they mobilize for something or other. Discovery 3, government panic, and global preparations. The current statement from the US Space Agency regarding Apophis remains consistent. It will not collide with our world in 2029. Our assessments are accurate. There is no risk. And for an extended period of time, they have reiterated this statement. Press releases, public pronouncements, media appearances. Apophis does not constitute a threat. However, secretly, in scientific reports and classified correspondence, you begin to notice a different disposition. Regarding the close flyby of 2029, Apophis will make another close approach to the world again in 2036 and then again in subsequent periods. With each close approach, planetary gravity will make minimal alterations to its orbit. The Space Corporation acknowledges that they cannot confirm with complete certainty the accuracy of Apophis's location after multiple gravitational encounters with the planet. Each close approach modifies the parameters. Each encounter brings additional uncertainties to the future calculation. Therefore, when they express conviction that there will be no shock in 2029, what they are concealing is that we are incapable of ascertaining the future. Actions resonate more loudly than words. Now let's examine what actually unfolds. In 2022, the Government Space Corporation put into operation the DART procedure, the Double Mineral Body Redirection System. The goal was to intentionally direct a spacecraft towards a mineral body to see if they could alter its orbital path. And it worked. They managed to reach the dimorphous mineral body and successfully recalibrated its trajectory. Why? What reason is there to spend hundreds of millions on mineral diversion technology tests if there is no possible risk? The formal explanation from the government agency is that it is a precaution. We are preparing for unimaginable future possibilities. However, consider the timeline. DART was triggered in 2021. Apophis makes its extremely close approach in 2029. They have been experimenting with trajectory-altering technology months before the closest encounter with a mineral body in the documented timeline. But it becomes even more fascinating. The branch of astronomical defense. In December 2019, the governor appointed the authorization standard for territorial protection, formally structuring the nation's aerospace contingent as the 6th Department of the Republic's troops. Currently, the legitimate task of the aerospace contingent includes the coordination of orbital machines, monitoring of orbital space, and shielding national interests in the cosmic realm. However, included in its mandate is something more specific: planetary protection, control and response to near-orbital occurrences that represent a possible threat. For what reason? Why would a territory constitute an unprecedented military department with billions in costs designated for cosmic protection if, according to official government information, there is no cause for concern? How is there so much speed involved? A global effort, and it's not limited to just one nation. The Continental Space Research Agency has its own planetary protection procedure. The Russian Empire announced programs to redirect mineral bodies. The Eastern Power is developing space surveillance systems. The Japanese Empire has transported research machines to investigate nearby mineral bodies. Every nation with an astronomy program is abruptly and intensely capitalizing on planetary protection. However, the timeline coincides entirely with the final phase of a generation. Everything intensifies as we approach 2029. Here is my diagnosis of what is happening. Citizens receive reassuring public statements, but behind closed doors, government officials are preparing for a situation they are not equipped to communicate. Because imagine the outcome if the government's astronomical corporation or any executive branch were to publicly announce that there is a 10% probability that Apophis would collide with Earth. Tumult, collapse of economic systems, community disorder. Even if they are preparing for Apophis, they are not preparing for absinthe. For absinthe is not merely a close encounter with a mineral body that may or may not collide. Absinthe is a prophecy, a divine sentence that will surely come to pass. And the timeline in which it comes to pass may reveal something about when the community of the faithful leaves the earth. Discovery 4, the 3.5-year countdown. We have therefore arrived at the passage that should prompt every individual who follows Christ to rise and devote maximum concentration. Sincerely. Because what I am about to reveal is not theorizing. It is not recklessly marking periods. It consists of arithmetic calculation, a pattern so rigorous that it is either a repetition of divine methods or the most extraordinary coincidence documented. The late researcher Tom Horn, who passed away in 2023, was a specialist in prophecy investigation and a composer who devoted extensive time to examining the connection between Apophis and religious prophecy. In 2019, he composed a work entitled The Wormwood Prophecy, where he argued that Apophis would be the fulfillment of Revelation 8. However, the most remarkable finding was not merely that. The mineral body matched the description. It was the timeline. Let me clarify what underpinned his thinking. The chronological systematization of the tribulation. Most proponents who investigate end-time studies support what is called the tribulation of a decade. This is based on Daniel 9:27, which outlines a 10-year period beginning with a covenant and ending with the resurrection of Christ. And he will make a pact with countless people for a period of time. And halfway through that period, he will suppress sacrificial offerings and sacrificial oblations. And through this offense, he will spread repugnance until its consummation. And that which has been sanctioned will be poured out upon the desolate. In prophetic language, a period represents 10 years. And the fragment states, in the middle of the phase, meaning at the midpoint, at the 5-year mark, something undergoes essential mutation. Currently, if Wormwood falls during the tribulation and the third trumpet blast in Revelation 8 occurs after several distressing events, most examiners place it somewhere near the midpoint of the tribulation period. Therefore, if Apophis crosses or collides in April 2029, this would place it approximately at the midpoint of a 10-year period, meaning that if you go back 5 years, you can pinpoint the beginning of the tribulation. Tom Horn performed this calculation, and lo and behold, he verified it. Going back 5 years from the date of the nearest event, this places it in October 2025, precisely during the Feast of Tabernacles, also called Sukkot, and not at any point during the festival. If you go back 5 years from the date of the closest approach to Apophis, you arrive at the 7th and final day of the Feast of Tabernacles. Currently, if you are not familiar with the knowledge of religious festivals, allow me to explain why this is something extraordinary. The Feast of Tabernacles represents one of the major festivals that the Creator instructed the Hebrews to preserve. It is described in Leviticus 23:33-43. The festival lasts for 7 days, and on each day, specific sacrifices were offered. However, the 7th day had a unique significance. On the 7th day of the Feast of Tabernacles, the early Hebrews offered 7 cows as sacrifices. And according to the inheritance of the rabbits, these 7 cows represented the Creator's intervention in the liberation of the 7 significant pagan nations and their deities. One of these deities was Apophis, the Egyptian deity of trouble, from whom the Creator emancipated the Hebrew population during the Exodus. Therefore, this is what Tom Horn revealed. 5 years before a mineral body called Apophis orbited the earth, precisely at the time when the ancient Hebrews honored the divine emancipation of Apophis. This may represent the beginning of the period of martyrdom. At the time they celebrated the defense of the Creator, they were 5 years removed from the tumult, precisely before the coming of the God of tumult to make contact with the earth. If this is a coincidence, it is the most remarkable coincidence in human history. But wait, there is much more. The connection to the Feast of Trumpets. The Feast of Tabernacles begins on the 15th day of the 7th period in the Hebrew calendar. However, 10 days before that, on the first day of the 7th period, there is another celebration, the Feast of Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah. And for those who believe in religious prophecies, the Feast of Trumpets has been permanently correlated with celestial ascension. Why? Because the mediator Saul links celestial ascension to a trumpet blast. 1 Thessalonians 4:16-17. For the Eternal One himself will descend from the heavenly place with a shout, with the voice of the messenger cherub, and with the trumpet sound of the Creator, and those who have fallen asleep in Christ will rise first. Subsequently, we who remain alive and remnant will be transferred together with them in the clouds, destined to meet the Eternal One in space. And in this way, we will remain perpetually with the Eternal One, the trumpet sound of the Creator. And again in 1 Corinthians 15:51-52, listen, I'm telling you a secret. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in an instant, in the twinkling of a glance, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and those who have fallen asleep will rise without any sign of decay, and we will be changed. During the Feast of Trumpets, a ram's horn instrument called a shofar is sounded 100 times in standardized sequences. The final, longest, and most vibrant blast is called the last trumpet. Paul uses this precise terminology when speaking of the last trumpet. Thus, for ages, researchers of prophecy have speculated that the celestial ascension may occur during a Feast of Trumpets at the moment the last trumpet sounds. Discovery 5, a sign's prediction. Currently, I need to transport it retrospectively in the timeline, going back to approximately 150 BC, roughly 150 periods before the manifestation of Jesus. In the arid region of the territory of Judah, near the depression of the Dead Sea, lived members of a Hebrew community known as the Essenes. They constituted a non-partisan group, deeply devoted to religious texts, subsisting in isolation from the corruption of the ecclesiastical order of Jerusalem, and they possessed a characteristic that distinguished them. They were soothsayers. What was the essence of the Essenes? The Essenes constitute the group that most scholars believe generated the Salt Depression Scrolls, among the oldest religious records ever catalogued. They researched prophecies with excessive diligence. They calculated timelines. They aimed for the fulfillment of past predictions, and 150 periods before the manifestation of Jesus, they began to predict what would originate from the Liberator. Here is what they predicted. First, the prophecy of the moment of his arrival. The Essenes expressed that the Liberator would come during the reign of a magistrate named Herod, who would begin by being righteous but would evolve into wickedness. This is precisely what happened. Herod the Mighty administered the region of Judea. At the moment Jesus was conceived, he began as a builder and manager, but he declined into paranoia and subjugated his entire family and the infants of Bethlehem. According to the prophecy, the moment of his end, the Essenes expressed that the Liberator would end in the period encompassing 32 AD. The majority of religious researchers place the crucifixion punishment between 30 and 33 BC, with numerous predictions settling in 33 BC. However, the Essenes composed 150 periods prior to the birth of Jesus. They highlighted the beginning of the periods in 30 BC. Third prophecy, the extent of his objective. The Essenes stated that the Liberator would not merely deliver for the Hebrew population, but would also be sacrificed for non-Hebrews, expanding emancipation to the entire universe. This is exactly what came to pass. Jesus manifested himself as the Hebrew Liberator, but his sacrificial offering extended to all ethnicities. Fourth prophecy, the time of mercy. It is at this point that the matter becomes extraordinary. The Aesir expressed that subsequent to the finitude of the deliverer, a time of mercy would ensue, extending for 2,000 periods. 2,000 periods. Throughout this phase, the communication of redemption would be offered to non-Hebrews. Divine judgment would be postponed. Beneficence would be extended to all who believe. However, they stated that this phase would have a conclusion. Fifth prophecy, the terminal period. The Aesir prophesied that subsequent to the 2,000 period phase of mercy, the human population would enter its terminal phase. And at what point would this 2,000 period phase end? If you start from 32 AD, the estimated date of sacrificial consummation according to their prophecy, and incorporate 2,000 periods, you get 2032 AD. Therefore, let's compile what we have. A mineral body named after the Egyptian deity of disturbance will collide with Earth on April 13th, 2029. A religious prophecy about a star called Wormwood falling from paradise and contaminating sources of desalinated water. A 5-year countdown to the approach of Apophis, arriving precisely on the 7th day of the Feast of Tabernacles in 2025. The occasion when the early Hebrew population commemorated the divine liberation of Apophis, a feast of trumpets, 10 days prior to that, customarily correlated with celestial ascension and the final trumpet, a 120-day countdown period from Pentecost to the sound of the trumpet, 120 being the religious number designating the end of a phase. Currently, I am not setting dates. I am not stating that I know the exact moment when Jesus will return. I'm not professing to possess privileged understanding that no one else possesses. However, I am communicating this. When ancient prophecies, religious celebrations, astronomical phenomena, and past divinations all converge on the same restricted timeline, we would be ignorant not to pay attention, for the Creator does not write arbitrary coincidences. He writes patterns, he writes timelines, he writes warnings. And when these warnings begin to accumulate with mathematical rigor, it is time to observe.